Hello, everyone, and welcome to our presentation today of the webinar, Do I Have to Love Myself First? Further Exploring Romantic Relationships in the Context of Eating Disorder Recovery, Part 2. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Erin Byerly, and I am your Alumni Services Coordinator, and I will be your moderator for today's online presentation. And I'm very excited to be hosting this part 2 of the presentation, as we got such a great response from part 1 that Ashley did earlier this year. And we know that relationships are a huge part of recovery, so having this specific focus on romantic relationships, I know is just going to be really helpful for everyone. So I would now like to introduce you all to today's presenter. Ashley Moser, LMFT CEDS, is a clinical education specialist at the Renfrew Centers. She received her bachelor's degree in psychology from the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign and her master's degree in marriage and family therapy from Northwestern University. Ashley has extensive experience in providing family therapy and clinical supervision with a focus in the treatment of eating disorders and co-occurring mood disorders. Ashley is a frequent speaker on the topic of body image, evidence-based treatment of eating disorders, and engaging families in the treatment process. And we're so happy to have her here doing this presentation. So I will turn it over to you, Ashley.
Thanks so much, Erin. And thank you so much to all of you for logging on and tuning in and joining us. So whether you are watching live or are watching this as a recorded version, I know this takes time out of your busy day in life. And so I really, really want to emphasize and appreciate how much it means to us. And I hope how much it means to you that you've created the space, an hour for your day to really dedicate towards the recovery process and thinking about it in the context of romantic relationships. So as Erin kicked us off and really noted the importance of this topic, I want to emphasize that. I really think a conversation about the intersection of eating disorders and romantic relationships is just so darn important. I can't think of two other places in which I hear more internalized messages, core beliefs, and maintaining aspects that support each other. So whether the eating disorder supports the relationship supports the eating disorder, there's a lot of crossover that can happen. So again, thank you so much for tuning in and joining us. And I'm really excited to share this topic with you and hopefully give you something that you can take away into your romantic relationships or future relationships to help you think about yourself, the eating disorder, and your relationships just a little bit differently. So our first slide today is really highlighting today's agenda. We're going to be a little fast and furious because this is a big topic and we only have an hour to really talk about it. But my hope is that you'll take away at least the three following things. We want to spend a lot of time identifying some of the challenges that are specific to romantic relationships in the context of eating disorders. Of course, this is a part 2. So we may not spend as much time there as maybe we did in part 1. And if you haven't watched part 1, please take a look at YouTube because we do have it listed there as an option to watch as well. Part 2, agenda to item 2, our hope is that we're going to practice applying learned skills from treatment in the context of romantic relationships. So today, because again, this is a part 2, I'm going to be teaching and reviewing some of the skills that are from the treatment experience that you've had with Renfrew and talk about how we then bring those into our romantic relationships. We focus a lot on those skills to eliminate symptoms and to work on distress tolerance in the context of the eating disorder. But if we're looking at this through a recovery lens, we need to take this skill set and apply it big picture. And there's no better place to do that than our romantic relationships. And the third component, which is new for our part 2, is to really do a little bit more of an in-depth dive on the topics of body image, communication, and meals in the context of romantic relationships, knowing that these are 3 areas in which we hear the most distress, concern that can show up in the recovery process. So without further ado, I want to have an important note on today's topic. I want to just kind of give us a little bit of a disclaimer that today is a really big topic, as I've alluded to. There's so much to cover when it comes to the intersection of eating disorders and romantic relationships. And we may not cover it all, even though this is a part 2. Our hope is to be able to do a more of an in-depth dive today. But again, because this is a big topic, we may not cover every aspect of everything, but we're going to do our best to lay a strong foundation. Another note that I want to really emphasize is that relationships are incredibly complex. They really exist on a spectrum and are defined by the people in them. No two relationships look alike. So today, in order for us to be as inclusive as possible, we're really going to focus on the use of romantic relationships as the term that we use to talk about relationships, because we want to be inclusive of multiple forms of relationships. We know that relationships can be very diverse, and we want to make sure that what we're talking about and teaching today is applicable across multiple forms of relationships. I also want to make a note that we're going to talk about the hard stuff when it comes to relationships and eating disorders, but I also want to really put a plug in there that relationships are hard and they are so worth it. They're not easy, right? Which is hopefully a portion of why you're reaching out and logging on today. It can involve a range of really difficult emotions, but we do know, especially post-pandemic, that connection is a huge predictor of overall emotional and physical well-being. So we know that relationships can be a huge source of healing, but can also be a huge source of complexity. Both can be true. So without further ado, based on that disclaimer, those disclaimers and those pieces, let's dive in today. So do you really have to love yourself before you can love someone else? That is the big question today, right? There's so many messages out there that reinforce this belief that you have to love yourself before you are worthy of someone else's love, before you are able to give and receive love, before you are able to engage in a healthy relationship. Is that statement true? Well, we're going to spend some time looking at that a little bit, and a little bit more through a critical lens versus just the societal messaging that we've received about this. There are a lot of pressures out there when it comes to relationships. And I see a lot of parallels in the pressures around relationships that I also see in the pressures around body image, if I'm completely honest. I can't think of two more places where there is so much pressure and messages about what you need to be, what you need to look like, what you need to do in order to be attractive, lovable, desirable, good enough. Being in a certain type of relationship, being at a certain relationship status has a lot of impact on how we see ourselves and how others see us, just as our bodies do. So it doesn't surprise me that the intersection of eating disorders and relationships can be a really complex topic, because there are two places that there's a lot of emphasis, a lot of societal messages that then get integrated and internalized for us as people. And we believe we have to follow and fit these messages in order to be okay, in order to be lovable, in order to be good enough. Where are some of these messages coming from? Let's talk about that now. So there's so much happening in the media. Tons and tons of diet culture influence, weight stigma, ageism. All those messages are very prevalent in all forms of media. I mean, it even shows up in our news. Social media is another component of this. There's so much comparison that goes on through social media. And there is an acute awareness of others' relationship status now more than ever. So it's not just as simple as even, 10, 15, 20 years ago with Facebook statuses about, are you in a relationship? Are you single? Is it complicated? Now we know just by watching if someone's picture comes down. It's just was a picture of the couple. Now it's just a picture of the individual. What's going on there? Or, oh, it's just a picture of the kids all of a sudden. There must be something happening. There's an acute vigilance and awareness of other people's relationship statuses and changes to those relationship statuses because of social media. Similarly, into how we see changes in acute awareness into people's body shapes and sizes. If we notice that someone's not posting full body anymore, or if we see that someone's weight has changed, we're so acutely aware of that, not just because we ran into them down the street or at the grocery store, but because we're seeing it and we're so living this connected life, even to people we don't see on a regular basis. So there's this acute awareness of bodies, and there's an acute awareness of relationship statuses. These messages are also coming through community. We know that there are a lot of standards, expectations from race, culture, ethnicity, from the region that you come from sexual orientation, from gender-specific norms, all around the beliefs around relationship status and what that means to you. If you came up from a family where people were married and in long-term committed relationships from a young age, and you're not, how does that feel? Does that mean that there's something wrong with you? Does your family give you pressure to increase your chances to be chosen, to be in situations in which you can then develop a relationship? How much emphasis is put on that over career, over health, over mental health? we see a lot of those messages showing up yet again, just like we see a lot of messages sometimes showing up from those same areas of life and community around body shape and size. And in hinting to this too, and talking about family, I think in the sense of community, families play a big role in this as well. And sometimes there can feel like there's a lot of generational patterns or beliefs around relationships and commitment and those pieces. There's also the fear of deviating from what other people have done and the fear of being criticized or judged. Similar as we see with relationship with body image as well. So again, acknowledging there's a lot of pressures and messages that can be easily influenced and internalized for anyone who is coming up and coming to a time in their life where they're exploring romantic relationships. We see a lot of these parallels happening in body image as well. So I'm guessing you probably have already been able to feel some of the problems with these mainstream messages. But if you haven't, I'm going to just make it real clear. The first problem that I see with some of these mainstream messages is that romantic relationships can become an ultimate form of validation. Being in a relationship somehow feels that you are then more worthy, deserving, lovable, attractive, desirable, all of those things that people want to be seen as. Being in a relationship feels like it validates that you are worthy. You are good enough because someone else is reflecting that back because they're choosing to be with you. That is a lot of pressure on a relationship, and there is a lot of externalizing our worth into the relationship. Red flags, major problems there, because if the relationship doesn't work out, the relationship changes, what do we do then? Are we still just as worthy and valuable? Maybe, maybe not. The second problem with some of these mainstream messages that I see is this belief that you need to be in a relationship to show that you are lovable. And if you are not in a relationship and you should be striving to be in a relationship. And in order to be in a relationship, there are a lot of messages out there that support the fact that you need to be thin. You need to be attractive. You need to be just easygoing, nonchalant, not very needy. And you also need to be healed. That is a tall order in order to develop connection, in order to develop a romantic relationship. And underlying both of these points is that there is this belief that you are not lovable as you are, that you need to be in a relationship, or you need to be in a small, thin body, and you need to not have needs. You need to be conventionally attractive, and you need to be emotionally healed in order to be worthy of that love. That is a real setup and a huge, huge vulnerability to the development and maintenance of an eating disorder. So in putting more of an eating disorder spin on this, there are a lot of challenges in relationships that are going to be more challenging for someone with a history of vulnerability to the development and maintenance of an eating disorder. We know that people pleasing can be a component of an eating disorder that can show up in romantic relationships. We know that there can be a history of isolating or shutting down. Denial of needs, I think that's a big one. I see that across the board on a weekly basis in talking about how do you get your needs met in a relationship when you yourself have a hard time meeting your own needs, or even acknowledging or being aware of when you have needs. There can be a lot of comparison we know that comes with eating disorders from body shape and size, but I see that a lot in comparison with other people's relationships. Their partner does this. If my partner doesn't do that, what does that mean about them? What does that mean about me? And I've also heard people talk a lot about past partner anxiety, feeling like they're always in comparison with the partner that came before them. And boy, is that challenging to address because that person isn't still there anymore, but we're comparing ourselves to them. We also know that specific challenges occur with those eating disorders in relationships because a lot of dating, a lot of romantic relationship connection-based activities surround food and movement. Dates are traditionally over candlelit dinners, or at least they are in social media and in movies. But that can be a specifically challenging event and point of connection for someone who's struggling with their relationship with food. We also know that sometimes there's a lot of dates that are around hiking, around movement. That can also be a point of concern. We know that body image is another piece of this that's incredibly challenging at times. If I don't love and appreciate and accept my body, how am I going to expect someone else to be able to do that too? And because of my eating disorder, because of the challenges I've had with my body, maybe physical touch is something I can't tolerate. So the thought of intimacy may be something that's really challenging. How do I address that? How do I compare? How do I compensate for something like that? Aging is another vulnerability. We know that, again, there's a lot of the intersection of, weight stigma and ageism and romantic relationships is a really interesting trifecta of feeling like not being good enough for love, not being good enough for relationships, not having as much worth. That's a huge vulnerability. And speaking of vulnerability, being vulnerable and sharing difficult emotional experiences is something that can be a challenge. And so to have to bring that forward in a romantic relationship when that's challenging for you as an individual is a big, big concern as well. We also know that accepting and receiving and believing compliments in a relationship can be very challenging too. So we have established that there are a lot of points of challenge and concern when it comes to the intersection of eating disorders and relationships. I also want to just quickly and briefly go over some of the stages. Of course, this is not an exclusive list, but some of the statuses and stages of relationships and some of those specific challenges. We know that those who are single, there's a lot of emphasis on appearance focus. We know that dating apps are a huge way that people find relationships. And in order to be able to feel like you are going to be chosen in those situations, you have to be your most attractive. And if there's a lot of belief systems and a lot of weight stigma and fat phobia that exists, it can be very difficult to show up if you feel like your body isn't the thin ideal, and it will then be not chosen. We know that there's a huge emphasis on being attractive and desirable. And sometimes people think it's more attractive and desirable to be overly pleasing, to not have needs, to be go with the flow, to avoid those questions from community and from family. What's wrong with them if they're not in a relationship? There can be so much urgency, anxiety, and pressure to be in a relationship to appease some of the uncomfortable emotions about being signal around body image, around relationship status, that it can really drive people into relationships that maybe aren't the best for them, or it may drive the eating disorder to show up in a more significant way. And I wish I could say that after you've found yourself single and have found a partner and are in a relationship, that goes away. But in reality, there's just new challenges that kind of come to light. I have a client right now who we worked through a lot of really significant belief systems around dating to actually be in a relationship. And to, interestingly enough, when we hoped that, of course, that would resolve some of the issues, it actually just changed the issues to be something a little bit different. So moving from single, the desire is to be chosen. In dating, the desire is to stay chosen and to maintain the relationship. And there's just as much focus and emphasis on trying to stay attractive throughout the dating process, even into committed relationships, in order to maintain, not just achieve the relationship, but maintain the relationship. And some of that shows up in the relationship with body. So we know that in dating, there's a lot of food-focused and movement-focused dates. That pressure to be chosen is still there if it's moving from a dating relationship to committed. There's this thought about vulnerability and intimacy. How much do I share? What do I feel comfortable with? Does that match what the other person feels comfortable with? And how do I maintain an individual sense of self while also starting to join as a couple? In terms of committed and relationships that have been separated, divorced, or re-entering dating, again, some of these same desires and these same urgencies to be chosen, to be validated through being in a relationship continue to show up. They may just shift a little bit different. Again, that message around maintaining relationships, this belief that you can't let yourself go. You have to keep your body small, contained, and fitting these thin ideals in order to keep the relationship going, in order to stay someone that's worthy of being chosen to stay in a relationship with. There's a lot of concern how the aging process can influence that. And of course, emotional intimacy is always an aspect, but becomes even more so in a committed relationship. If you're missing that feeling of being seen and heard and validated in the relationship, that can be a real source of entry point for an eating disorder behavior to show up. If we're feeling not seen, not heard, not supported in our relationships, an eating disorder may show up as a way to get those feelings met, of course, in a roundabout way. There's also a lot of transitions that can happen during committed relationships. There can be transitioning to parenthood. And that's another place where there can be a lot of emotional intimacy disconnection, again, increasing likelihood for eating disorder development and maintenance. And for those who are coming out of a relationship, whether it's divorce or just separation or ending of a relationship and looking to re-enter, I hear so many people report feelings of failure. Because again, if being in a relationship is the ultimate source of validation that you are worthy, that you are a good person, that you are lovable and okay, the ending of a relationship takes that away. I'm not those things if I'm not in a relationship. I've failed. I'm not lovable. And I think aging is another component to this. If you're looking at re-entering the dating scene and looking to start looking for a partner or a new relationship, how does my appearance influence my desirability at this stage of life versus how it did when I was in my last relationship? There's a lot of fear of availability of new partners, merging of families. So again, this is a very surface level kind of overview of some of the challenges that can show up, but we can very easily see that this relationship with the body and the intersection of romantic relationships at a variety of stages increases the vulnerability for the use of the eating disorder to show up for the first time, reemerge, or maintain. So going back to our original question, do I have to love myself first? What does the research actually say? We've really outlined that there's a lot of potential problems and concerns, but what does the research tell us? In scouring the research, the most concrete, tangible stuff I can pull up from says that research does actually suggest that feelings of worthlessness and low self-esteem can interfere with relationships. I don't think that's surprising to anyone, right? That if we feel poorly about ourselves, it can show up and interfere with relationships. The point that I want to make sure to emphasize, because there is a difference between low self-esteem and worthlessness interfering with a relationship, it doesn't mean that it disqualifies you from having a relationship. It doesn't mean that those things have to be healed in order for you to be in a relationship. There are a lot of people who benefit from doing individual work prior to going into a relationship, but there's something really important and special about that time in a relationship that if you are healing in connection with someone else, that can be really, really enhancing too. But to circle back to the research, it does show that those who question their own self-worth are more likely to vigilantly monitor their partner's behavior for signs of it, and they may mistaken or interpret benign acts as rejecting. That's important to think about. Those with negative self-views are going to be more likely to be drawn to those who also see themselves negatively. And if you think you don't deserve happiness, you may tolerate poorer treatment in relationships. And people with low self-esteem tend to underestimate their partner's love. They may have less optimism and less satisfaction in their relationships as well. So we can see that the low self-esteem and worthlessness absolutely does interfere and can influence relationship satisfaction. It does not mean that you are doomed and cannot have an actual romantic relationship that is healthy, however. So because I've kind of painted such a dim picture on all of this, I want to liven it up and give us some hope and infuse that as we transition into the rest of our phase of our conversation today. So if you resonate with these issues, if you resonate with some of the things that I've said so far today, is your question going through your head like, am I doomed? My response to that, absolutely not. There is always hope. There is always healing. There is always opportunity. And so as much as social media may perpetuate some of these messages around, you're not going to be able to be in a healthy relationship unless you love yourself first. Social media also really has some funny things that I like to infuse in some of my presentations too, to keep it light and to not take ourselves too seriously with this too. So even though there is evidence to support the fact that the combination of eating disorder and romantic relationship can be challenging, there are things we can do about this. There is hope. And the fact that you're even joining us in a conversation about it is the first step towards that. So this is where your skills from treatment come in handy. And if you've done our part 1, we talked about what those skills are. Today, instead of just going an overview of the skills, we're going to talk about application. What does this look like in the context of romantic relationships? Because hopefully in treatment, those skill sets were incredibly beneficial to help you move away from the eating disorder behaviors. Maybe yes, maybe no. And even if that was not the case, having that skill set can be very beneficial. And I want to talk with you about not just how it applies to the eating disorder, but how does this apply to a relationship? How do I bring what I've learned from treatment and what I've learned about myself into romantic relationships, knowing how important they are and knowing how vulnerable I may be to experience an increase in symptoms or some sort of, reoccurrence of the eating disorder because of the emotional aspects. So we do know, of course, eating disorders are emotional disorders, and there are a lot of eating disorder symptoms that show up in response to the difficult emotions that arise in romantic relationships. There is a lot of anxiety in romantic relationships, especially early on. There's a lot of guilt, sometimes hopelessness, grief, shame. There's also a lot of positive emotions that show up in a relationship. There's excitement, there's joy, there's pleasure. And believe it or not, those emotions can be just as difficult to tolerate as some of the more traditionally deemed negative emotions. So because relationships are just chock full of emotions, it makes sense that eating disorder behaviors may show up as a way to mitigate, manage, suppress, control those emotions. So let's see what that can look like. So eating disorder behaviors function in relationships. They can function as a source of distraction, disconnection, a way to manage uncomfortable emotions, and they provide a false sense of control. I almost want to underline and italicize this one because I think this is where I see eating disorder behaviors function the most. We believe that if we can just change our physical appearance, shrink our bodies, control our bodies, that we have an increased likelihood of being able to control the outcome of our relationships. The scariest thing, the hardest thing, the thing that gives us the most feeling of being out of control, I think, in the whole wide world is trying to control other people, trying to control their opinion of us, their choosing of us, their staying with us. At the end of the day, we can't control what other people do. We can't control if they choose us and stay with us. And it feels like we can, though, if we just manage our weight, shape, and size. If we just keep our feelings to ourselves and quiet and small. If we just manage these parts of our lives, it increases the likelihood that someone will choose us and continue to choose us. That belief system is BS, but that belief system also creates, as you can understand, a huge vulnerability for an eating disorder. So I want to emphasize that the eating disorder in romantic relationships, more often than not, functions as this false sense of control and keeping ourselves connected. And I get that. Connection is a huge source of life. It's the thing that brings us pleasure and joy. And it's what life is all about in a lot of ways. And we feel like we can control it if we control ourselves, if we control our emotions and we can control our bodies. We'll keep people choosing us and being with us so we're not alone. But in reality, we create a lot of disconnection and a lot of harm by engaging in the eating disorder to do so. I also see eating disorders functioning as a partner sometimes. Sometimes relationship with food is the most reliable and dependable relationship you've ever had. And we know that eating disorder behaviors really feel like they meet needs in the short term. It gives us that sense of relief, soothing, regulation, all things we would turn to a partner for. But if you've had experience where partners have been unreliable and just not dependable or unavailable, it makes sense that turning to something that would meet all of those needs and would do so reliably would be something that would be very attractive, very appealing, and be something that would be a maintaining factor for the eating disorder. I've even had a client explain it that at the end of a night out with friends, that she was the only friend that would be going home alone. Everyone else was coupled and partnered. And when she would go home, she would engage in her eating disorder. She would binge and purge. And that the binging and purging almost felt like her partner because it felt like at the end of the day, she wasn't going home alone. She was going home with her eating disorder. She was going home to her eating disorder. And that felt much more safe and comfortable than sitting in the discomfort of being the uncoupled person in the situation. And in order to deal with some of that discomfort or those emotions, that the eating disorder really showed up to help soothe those. And again, we've talked about this throughout the presentation, that eating disorder really does function as a way to appear more lovable through being thin, needless, and emotionless. How many people remember this from treatment? Probably quite a few. The downward arrow is one of those skills that people love to hate because it helps us get to the root of why we think and interpret situations the way that we do. It's a really, really helpful tool, but it gets us in touch with some pretty painful stuff. It gets us down to what we call our core beliefs. And our core beliefs greatly influence how we see ourselves and how we see others. This is very, very, very applicable when it comes to romantic relationships. Here are some of the common core beliefs I talk about on a very regular basis with those who are struggling with eating disorder recovery or are in eating disorder recovery and are embarking upon romantic relationships. There is a belief that they are unlovable at the bottom of their downward arrow. The belief that they will end up alone. That's a huge one. I would rather be in the eating disorder and be connected than be alone. People who feel that at the bottom of their core belief that they're not good enough, not worthy, not deserving, that they're bad, that they're a bad person, or that they're too much. I was meeting with someone earlier this week talking about how much controlling her body was related to the belief that she was too much. She grew up as a child with significant anxiety and was just a highly emotive child, big feelings, and was met with a lot of messages, meant or not meant, perceived or real, that she was too much. And so there's an ingrained core belief that I am too much as I am. And so now that she's at an age where she's looking to increase her connection and dating and partnership, there is this core belief that she is too much. And in order to compensate for her too muchness, her body needs to be smaller. And that connection, we needed to know that, because it's not just about let's eliminate the symptoms. Why are these symptoms so darn hard to eliminate, especially in connection to the thought of dating and engaging in romantic relationships? It was this core belief of too much. That was what we were really talking about, not talking about weight. So if we understand what our core beliefs are, we can then understand that we are more likely to be seeing ourselves and others through the lens that is influenced by our core beliefs. So whether or not the situation in front of us was reflecting back to us that we are too much, even a benign situation, we are going to be interpreting ourselves and what other people are saying about us and experiencing about us through the lens of our core belief. So in the example with this client, she has been told for years that she is too much, goes into a dating situation, and the person ghosts. They had a nice date, everything went well, falls off the face of the earth, never to be heard from again. The core belief of being I'm too much pops up. And we then are interpreting the ghosting as confirmation that she was too much. And that because of that too muchness and the distress of having that core belief, feeling like it was confirmed, then increased the distress and increased the desire to engage in more restriction and more binging and purging. So an example again about how that core belief influences our thoughts and reinforces the need for the eating disorder behavior. And like I said, there are a lot of relationship scenarios that occur that could show up and cause us to influence or interpret them as through our core beliefs. So here are some of the common relationship scenarios that are benign, neutral, potentially even have nothing to do with us. However, I hear so often core beliefs showing up and influencing how people interpret themselves based on this scenario. So if they don't get if they're left on red, they don't get a response. Ghosting in particular, I hear a lot of. If they're with a partner and they're in a relationship and that person's always distracted and on their phone. Physical intimacy is another place I hear a lot of core beliefs and automatic appraisals happening, whether that person's seeking too much intimacy or not enough. If they're ignoring requests for help for shared responsibilities, I asked you to help me with this and you didn't. Compliments, not complimenting, food comments, past partner anxieties and communication. All of these situations, if influenced through the lens of the core belief that I am too much, you're going to then interpret these situations as reconfirming that, yes, you in fact are too much. If you were less, that person wouldn't be on their phone all the time because they wouldn't have to distract or disconnect because you're always too much. If they wouldn't, they'd be, seeking more physical intimacy from you if you weren't so much. These core beliefs show up and influence our romantic relationships very, very significantly. So we have to pay attention to when they're at hand. And one of the ways that we can do that is through applying this concept that we learned in treatment of thinking traps. Thinking traps are going to happen when our core beliefs are activated. We're going to be more likely to jump to the conclusion that our core belief is being confirmed. And we're going to also catastrophize and have the worst case scenario thought occur. So what I oftentimes hear is a benign situation like someone being left on red. They jump to the conclusion that this is confirmation that I actually am too much. And the worst case scenario happens where because I am too much, I am going to be rejected and I'm going to end up alone. No one will ever love me and I will be on my own. And if I'm on my own forever, my family will think there's something wrong with me. I will miss out on life's opportunities. I won't get to have a family the way that I wanted to, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we're jumping to the conclusion that this person's behavior or lack of behavior is about my too muchness. And then we're assuming that the worst case scenario is happening and that's going to be the truth for you for life. That if this instance confirms that you are too much and you are going to be too much forever, and therefore you are going to end up alone. So we need to do some work on how we reappraise this. How do we counterbalance this? We know we all have core beliefs based on our lived experiences. And we know that they're going to show up in moments where there are these relationship scenarios. What do we do when they get activated? What I want to remember is the difference between connection and disconnection. That's what I want us to take away from today. Our automatic appraisal is often going to be rooted in that core belief. So I'm going to interpret that other person's behavior as demonstrating to me that they are not interested in me. It is rejecting of me. They're not attracted and they're selfish and lazy. That's driven by my core beliefs. But how can I reappraise that? Reappraisals can be a place that I think some people kind of roll their eyes and are like, it's just thinking the opposite, or it's just thinking of something that's different. I don't really believe it, but I'm going to do it because, my therapist is telling me to. Reappraisals really matter and they really work, but we have to use them often and we have to practice them constantly for them to work. So if we see someone always on their phone and our first response is that I'm too much for them, which is why they're on their phone, because they have to disconnect because me talking about myself and my feelings is too much for them. That is going to cause me to disconnect and shut down. But if I see it through the lens of like, oh, they just got an important text from work, or an email came through about the concert that we're going to tonight, or something's going on with the kids' school and it pulled their attention away. That is not about me. That is not about my too muchness. That is about them. And is it likely that my too muchness is going to be the thing that's driving them to look at their phone? Maybe that's on the table. Maybe that's possible. But is that possible every single time, especially if you're not even in the room or not even engaging with them, or you're not even having a bad day? Maybe it really is about work or another responsibility, or maybe it's about them and how they're feeling. If we add that possibility in, it changes our emotional response. It changes us from having one more situation that confirms that we are too much and causes us to pull away from the relationship and shut down, versus it gives us the possibility that this could be because of something else that's going on. And instead of me shutting down, maybe I'll lean in and ask. So I'm hitting on this now, that whether you have an automatic appraisal or you work to reappraisal, is the difference between disconnecting from your relationship and reconnecting with your relationship. If you interpret the other person's behavior as confirmation that you are too much, not enough, and are going to die alone, you are more likely going to isolate, shut down, withdraw, lash out, distract, and assume. What I want to ask is us to do the opposite. Use the reappraisal. Ask yourself what else could be happening here, especially ask yourself what could be happening here that has nothing to do with you. Because if that's the case, you're going to communicate. Hey, you're on your phone a lot. Are you all right? Or, hey, I feel really ignored right now. I'm trying to talk with you and you're on your phone. Can you put it down? Or set a boundary. Hey, after dinner each night, I'd really like for us to both put our phones down and have a conversation. I feel more connected to you when that's happening. Or, hey, I'm noticing this. The story I tell myself is that you're doing this because I'm too much. Is that what's happening here? Asking. Very, very different responses. That's why automatic appraisals, that's why reappraisals matter so much in romantic relationships in particular. It can be the difference between pulling away from your relationship or reconnecting and seeking that co-regulation and soothing in your relationship. I also want to just put a plug out there that most of the time, this Disconnection is all our partners see. They don't know, they don't see you jumping to the conclusion. They don't see your core beliefs. They don't see all this internal process that's happening here. They just see disconnection. They see shutting down, isolating, and withdrawing. They may not do the thing we want them to do by following us and saying, what else is going on? Are you okay? I'm noticing this. They may not have the skill set to do that. Hopefully someday, but maybe not today. They see the disconnection. What do they do? What do most people do when they see people disconnecting from them? They disconnect too. And before you know it, you're on opposite sides of the room and you're very disconnected. So what about meals in romantic relationships? We're talking about the romantic relationships in a very abstract kind of big picture way, but let's talk about some of these scenarios that are a little bit more eating disorder vulnerable and specific. So we know that meals can be an inherent part of relationships. Everyone has to eat. Oftentimes when you're in a relationship, you eat together because it's just kind of convenient and it's easier from like a food bill and grocery bill perspective. It can also be a source of connection, fun, pleasure. Food can taste good. Going out places where there's good food, a good conversation can feel really good. The reason why we see all of these candlelit dinners all over the, social media and Lifetime movies is because there is something about that setup of eating good food, having good communication, and having time that's dedicated to sit across from the person you care about and look them in the eye. There's something about that that feels really good. But if you've had an eating disorder history or are currently struggling, meals can also very much be emotional. And they can include a lot of these emotionally driven behaviors we talked about through the disconnection perspective. Eating in isolation and secrecy, compensation, restriction. I have a client that I've talked a lot about, and the thing that we see showing up the most is the compensation that can happen in the eating in isolation and secrecy, that dates caused so much anxiety, not because of the fear of what the conversation was going to look like, or what am I going to wear, or I'm feeling kind of awkward. But the fact that they knew that they couldn't allow themselves to eat before the date because of the fear of their abdominal area being distended and being less attractive and desirable. So the restriction prior to the date caused so much anxiety and so much discomfort. And then after the date, having to go home and eat and to binge eat to make up for the deficit in calories and the nutritional needs that didn't get met throughout the day and during the date. That pattern, the compensation, became so distressing that it felt better to be alone and not to date than it did to engage in these pattern of restriction and binging. So I want to also emphasize that meals, while they can have so much a good benefit, from a connection perspective, they can be especially tricky if you're struggling with an eating disorder actively or historically. So what do we recommend then? So here are some of the recommendations, and you're going to notice a theme as I talk about some of these leftover topics that we're going to talk on towards the end of today's time. So recommendations include awareness. I want you to notice your automatic appraisals and how are they influenced by your core belief. If you're this person who knows that you interpret yourself as being too much, does that automatic appraisal influence the fact that you want to show up and not be too much at the meal and at that opportunity for connection or that date? What are some of the thinking traps that come from that? And how are those rooted in that core belief of being too much? So if your automatic belief is that you are too much and you want to compensate for your too muchness, how does that show up? How could that influence your behavior? We want you to then move to reappraise. What else could be possible? If your automatic belief is that too muchness, what else could be true? Is it that you're too much? Or is this that this relationship is new? Is this person who's temperamentally more withdrawn or shy? There's so many other possibilities that could be happening here. We want to then notice, what are the emotionally driven behaviors? Because my core belief is activated, am I more likely to restrict? Am I more likely to compensate through exercise? Am I more likely to binge after the date? And we want you to engage in alternative and connective driven behaviors. If you're picking up on signals that are influenced by your core belief that you are too much, how can you lean in and ask, hey, I notice you're more quiet. Is something going on? And get more information. Maybe that person does validate the too muchness, but my guess is that they will not. It has something to do with them. It has something to do with their experience and less to do with the person on the other side of the table. And I'm using a lot of examples that are kind of early relationship examples, but this can also be happening sitting in your own kitchen, dining room, living room, when you've been in an established and committed relationship for quite some time. I even want to say that those interactions are even more profound, because the longer you've been with someone, the longer relationship history you have with them, which sometimes can be good, but a lot of the time, if there's been historical issues and points of disconnection, there could be a lot more history happening right then and there at that dining room table, in the living room, around that meal. That there's not just about right here and now. There may be a lot of things that are rooted in the lived experience in that relationship around meals that could be just as prevalent. So I know a lot of these examples are early dating relationship examples. I guess I want to acknowledge that it's even more complex and potentially even more emotionally rich when you are in a longer term, more committed relationship too. When it comes to body image in romantic relationships, I oftentimes hear people wanting quick fixes for this one. How do I start to normalize and accept and have a neutral relationship with my body so that I won't have my body image influencing or interfering with my relationship? Body image work is hard. It's why so many people want to rush to the quick fix with it. But again, we know that body image, in particular in romantic relationships, there's a lot of desire and emphasis to try to control the body size to acquire and maintain romantic relationships. I think there's a lot of weight stigma and fat phobia that creeps into body image and relationships in particular. There's a lot of fear of rejection and abandonment, and a lot of generational messaging and lived experience with trying to control the body, and having instances of having more attraction, desirability, people showing appreciation and complimenting smaller bodies than if your body is larger. And it's very hard to push back against lived experience in particular, where you've been complimented, accepted, and deemed more attractive or worthy at a lower weight, even if that lower weight was a place in which it was very unhealthy for you. I also want to acknowledge that body image and the connection to physical intimacy in romantic relationships is pretty significant as well. If I am having negative body image or poor body image, how do I then continue to remain in a physically intimate relationship with my partner? I've heard a lot of people say that they feel like their sexual health, their desire has really been influenced and impacted by their eating disorder. And they feel like they almost have to make up for it or compensate for it. Like there's this part of me that doesn't meet societal expectations or the expectations that I have for how I should show up in this relationship. So I need to make up for it in other ways, or I need to do things in the relationship that compensate for the fact that this isn't a place that I feel like I can show up. And I want to acknowledge that that does happen a lot, especially because we know that eating disorders can influence and impact sexual health and reproductive health. And I mentioned earlier on that physical touch and connection to the body can be very difficult to tolerate. And so how do you heal the relationship with the body so that you can be a part of a physically connected relationship? There are some people who may not ever want that. That may never be on your list of things that you want to achieve in the recovery process. But being in a relationship where we all know about love languages, right? Some people do have that love language is physical touch. And how do you make sense of that and navigate that if your partner has physical touch needs and that's something that you do or don't have? Like I said, very complicated, very rich, very complex. And so because of that, there's so much more we can always say and do and talk about that. I think there's a whole presentation here in itself. So from a recommendation perspective, you're going to see the same recommendations from meals for body image and also for our next point of conversation, which is communication. Because at the end of the day, it isn't about the meal. It isn't about the body. It never was. It's about the emotion that's driving it. It's about our core beliefs. It's about these messages that have been internalized and how we push back against them to stay connected to ourselves and connected to the relationships that we want to be in. So we want to have awareness into our automatic appraisals, the thinking traps, the core beliefs. Where is my too muchness showing up in my relationship with my body? What else could be possible? Is my body too much? Is it too big? Is it too whatever? What does that bring up for me emotionally when I think that? And what are the emotion-driven behaviors that I have? Do I want to avoid physical touch? Do I want to avoid physical connection? And how do I engage in alternative and connective-driven behaviors? And maybe that has nothing to do with the body and nothing to do with the physical. Maybe it means I need to have a conversation and we need to put our phones down and talk to each other and use some of the communication skills we're going to talk about next. Communication is a huge component and a huge recommendation when it comes to working through relationships, and whether, I guess, just in general, but especially so if there's an eating disorder history or present. Communication isn't just to share how you feel or have the person validate and see how you feel. I think this point from Doctors Julie and John Gottman is really important, that the goal of conversation is to understand, not to problem solve. We want to be able to bring our internal world externally for the person we're in a relationship with, so that they can understand what we're going through and how we're feeling. Only then can that person respond in a way to hopefully meet those needs. So we need to use the following skills. And I think these 3 bullet points are a good jumping off point when it comes to communication. We want you to put feelings into words. So when people are able to find the right images, phrases, and metaphors and words to fit their feelings, it feels like there's a resolution, because the other person can say, oh, I get it. They don't have to agree with it. They don't have to tell you that you're right for feeling how you feel, but they can reflect back to you that, oh, that's what's going on. And there's something that's really soothing about having someone reflect back to you that they get it. They get what you're talking about. We want to ask a lot of open-ended questions. So if I'm walking through the world with this core belief that I am too much, I don't want to go into the situation that says, you think I'm too much, don't you? It's too much for you again. You can't handle this. You don't have the capacity. Very different than saying, I'm feeling like this. Tell me how you're feeling. Or the story I'm telling myself is this. What's actually happening here for you? And we also want to look at skill number 3, which is expressing empathy. So we don't just need this to be a one-sided situation. We also need to be expressing empathy for the partner, in addition to wanting that empathy in return. And we want to hold space for both perceptions to be valid. So even if we're on 2 different sides of a situation, or I'm expressing how I feel and this person just really doesn't get it or understand it, and their experience, I don't really understand or get either, but I want to be able to hold space that both of our experiences can be true. You can feel this way and I can feel this way, and it's okay that they don't line up. This is a very brief and short jumping off point for communication skills, but a great place to start if you're wanting to increase that connection and move away from those EDBs, those disconnecting behaviors. So as you can see, same recommendations: awareness, reappraise, notice, and engage. The communication is really the number 1 alternative action in romantic relationships. The best thing we can do is to communicate, to express, to ask questions. The things that I encourage and prescribe most often in talking to people about relationships, especially those who've struggled with eating disorders, when they are wondering what the other person is thinking, or they want to share how they've been feeling, the story I'm telling myself is that I'm too much. Let the other person respond. This is what I hear when you say blank. So when you say you're exhausted and you need a break, I hear that I'm too much. Is that what you mean? Is that what's happening? Bringing the internal external, but instead of doing it in an accusatory way, lashing out, shutting down, asking questions, bringing it together, leaning in, getting more connected. So this brings us to a stopping point. I realize I've talked so much, there's not a ton of time for Q&A, but again, because this is such a big topic and there's so much to say, once I get started, I have a hard time stopping. So I am now, happy to answer any questions and think about anything that could be helpful that has kind of come to your minds as you've been listening to me talk about today's topic.
Actually, I feel like everything you shared was such good and helpful information. I'm good with having a shorter time for questions.
Okay, good.
So I think the thing to start is like, how do we know when we're at a place where we might be helped or hurt by a relationship, like with our own work?
That's a good question. So are you saying like, how do you know if being in a relationship is actually helpful for the healing versus not helpful?
Yeah.
Okay,
Like,
gotcha.
thinking about jumping back into the dating pool, it's like, how do I know when I'm ready?
Oh, that's such a good question. Yes, no, I really like that. Okay, so I think from that perspective, you have to pay attention to intention. So it's very similar to what we talk about when we talk about movement, when we talk about a lot of things. What is the intention behind getting back out there? What is the intention behind leaving the relationship? What is the intention behind that? Is it because there is something healing on the other side of the behavior? Is getting back out there something that's going to move you closer towards you being able to tolerate emotions, move through them, and engage in a relationship from a healthy perspective? Or, which I think this happens in a lot of the time, we jump back into another relationship because we cannot tolerate being alone. Kind of what I talked about at the top, there's a lot of pressure out there to be in a relationship and to be kind of defined and confined by, traditional relationship standards and statuses. If not being in a relationship creates more discomfort than being in a relationship, you may find yourself cyclically being in relationships to avoid that discomfort. That would be a time in which I would say, let's pause. You don't have to take yourself off the apps, but maybe we don't look at anything serious for a minute. And let's take a look at what is so uncomfortable about not being chosen. What is so uncomfortable about being alone? And let's think about that. I think about that too for people in committed relationships that choose to leave. And there are a lot of people that hit the same point in relationships and are like, I'm out. Like, this is enough. I've done what I can do. A lot of that has to do, again, with an emotional distolerance or intolerance of what's going on in the relationship. Do you reach a point where there's so much emotional vulnerability and intimacy that it's very hard to tolerate? I can't tolerate someone being this close to me, knowing this much about me, or asking or wanting that. It's too much, it's too uncomfortable, and so I'm going to leave the relationship. If you're making a move to avoid discomfort that is from an emotional perspective, that of course has nothing to do with like safety and health and all of those things. If you're going to or leaving a relationship because of discomfort, that's a sign that there's some more information to be gathered there. And let's pause, let's get into therapy, or let's bring this into therapy and talk more about it. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I love that idea that it's really about intention, because I think so much of the work goes back to, well, why am I doing it? What's motivating it? What's the intention? For sure.
Exactly.
And you touched a little bit on like the lived experiences. What if we notice, like, while we're trying to date or we're in a relationship, that our beliefs are kind of being reinforced, and like we're having almost more of those lived experiences? What do we do in those moments?
That is some tough stuff. I mean, my hope would be is that would be one of those moments where you would kind of question, is this the right relationship? And I think that can be a really scary thing, right? Because if you've had a lot of lived experience where you've been given messages, I'll just keep using the too much. You've been too much your whole life. You're in a relationship that's now reflecting back to you that you are too much. It may feel really familiar. It may feel really safe. It may feel really okay, even though it probably isn't, right? So just because it's familiar and it feels safe and it feels okay doesn't mean that it is actually for your emotional health and healing. And so in a situation like that, definitely doing some therapeutic work to really identify how can I, if I stay, what is the outcome? If I go, what is the outcome? If I navigate something in the middle, what does that mean? But I do think pushing up against these messages that reinforce the need to shrink yourself, compensate for who you are, decrease your needs. If you're in a situation like that, I think those are typically signs to me that this may be a relationship that could be adding to the challenges and reinforce the need for potentially coping skills like an eating disorder to show up. And that to me is a vulnerability that really has to be addressed.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And we are already a minute over, so we will end there. Ashley, I want to thank you so much for presenting part 2 of this webinar. Like Ashley said, if you are looking for part 1, you can find that on the Renfrew Center's YouTube channel, so check that out. And on behalf of myself and the Renfrew Center Foundation, I want to thank you all so much for joining us today. And Ashley, thank you so much for presenting. If you have any questions we didn't get to, please feel free to reach out either to Ashley or to alumni@renfrewcenter.com. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.